What are some ways to ensure that your students understand you?
Okay, so there are a lot of factors at play when we talk about learners understanding the language being used in the classroom. But I think an important first piece or a first place to start is the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Language Learning. So this framework was designed to set standards and descriptors for what a learner can use and say at different levels of language usage. The framework has descriptor scales that run from A1 to C2, with A1 being a beginning language learner and user, and C2 being someone who can use the language in all aspects of their life, in their personal life, in their professional life, in their educational life, and in the public domain. So another important component of the Common European Framework of Reference is that it makes a distinction between receptive language skills, which are what a language user can hear and understand, or read and understand, and productive language skills, what a user can say or write. So when we talk about checking for understanding, this is a really important distinction to bear in mind. Learners may be able to understand the subject matter being spoken about in the classroom, but they might not yet feel comfortable participating or producing responses. So when we're checking for understanding, it's really important to check that we're both looking at what their receptive skills and their productive skills. And then a final aspect of the Common European Framework of Reference that I would mention is that it's a competence-based approach. So learners are assessed on what they can do with the language and not what they can't do or what they don't know yet. This is an additive approach that ensures a focus on what the learner can do and this idea of developing language abilities. It's motivating, it highlights the ongoing nature of language acquisition. There's always more about language to be learned, but also everybody can do something with language. So in addition to the Common European Framework of Reference, I would also like to talk about 3 key dimensions related to learners using language to access content. So the first is mindsets, the second models, and the third methods. So generally speaking, mindsets are the epistemological frameworks or the belief systems that we bring to the classroom, which inform what we do, inform our teaching, inform our actions. Models are the structures we use to think about and organize our classroom practices. And then methods are the actual tools and techniques we use in the classroom. So mindsets, models, and methods have a huge impact on how inclusive and accessible the classroom space is, and then also how well learners can use the language of instruction to access the content being addressed. A last point that's important to highlight is that mindsets, models, and methods are applicable to all types of language users in language learning settings. So the learners might be studying in their first language, they might be studying in their second language, they might be in a bilingual setting. The bottom line is that it's important for teachers to consider the language being used and the linguistic makeup of their classroom, which are almost always multilingual settings. What kinds of mindsets would be important to adopt when focusing on language learning for all in the classroom?
In all classrooms exist various linguistic resources to take into account. A teacher with a perspective of language awareness wants to make sure that all the learners have also linguistic access to the contents. Students' text worlds, especially the media environments, has a lot of learning potential, whatever the subject or content is. Students' multilingualism can consist of languages and their variants that have been developed mostly at home and during the free time in hobbies. For example, following football leagues, fan sites, or playing online games in multilingual communities promotes special dictionary and phrases that are useful also in formal learning settings. All this describes a mindset that includes the cultural and linguistic background of the learners and is meaningful in planning and acting out instructional choices. Being aware of this potential in classroom, for example, students' text worlds and media environments, a teacher can better facilitate learners' agency, motivate them to studying contents, and sometimes also give them tools for learning in and non-formal settings. It's up to a teacher if they recognizes this linguistic competence and makes arrangements under it as a part of linguistic and cultural learning environments.
Another important aspect of mindsets is relationship between students and teacher, which is fundamental and influences the pupil's attitudes towards learning and knowledge, especially for a language. The mediation of teacher is strong, and students' engagement is limited to the personal relationship with them and to learning what they have chosen. Therefore, teachers should promote the emotion of knowing and a strong human relationship, because students will have difficulty learning from tools they don't love. Only when teachers obtain admiration from their students can they promote enthusiasm and interest in their school subject, particularly in case of language learning. Moreover, if students enjoy learning, they would like to engage for searching a personal well-being instead of satisfaction in the result. In fact, the experience of a positive or negative situation provokes pleasure or displeasure that will return each time the same kind of situation is recognized. In this process, motivation to learn plays a key role, because the characteristics of students and social variables of educational system are combined. On the one hand, there are the curiosity to learn and discover, the desire to feel competent and autonomous in choices, the need for social acceptance, and on the other hand, there are the teaching methods, the learning objectives, and the type of reinforcement used, and so on. Therefore, motivation may be supported by the teacher or by the content itself, but the student's role must be not passive in this process, since they must take responsibility for their own learning with volition based on their will to act.
So a final aspect of mindsets that I would like to talk about relates to beliefs and errors. So there's quite a bit of empirical evidence showing that beliefs inform the mindsets teachers bring to the classroom. So it's worthwhile spending some time reflecting on your beliefs about teaching and learning in general, and specifically about language and language learning. And one area where this is particularly important relates to errors, and specifically attitudes towards language errors. So how can teachers approach errors in order to encourage and motivate learners? So first of all, I would say take out the words correct or incorrect, and rather errors can be framed as appropriate or inappropriate rather than correct or incorrect. Errors are very context dependent, and in most situations it doesn't matter if the grammar or the syntax is perfect. The goal is usually to communicate something. What the CFR, or the Common European Framework of Reference, refers to as communicative language. So the focus should be whether the point the learner is trying to convey is being successfully communicated. Another important mind shift in seeing errors is seeing them in a positive light, as a source of information. Oftentimes, errors can provide insights into what learners can and know in the language. So for example, a learner using ed ending on an irregular verb like fighted shows that the learner has the knowledge of the regular ed ending. So then we can be excited about that, and it shows us a little bit about what's going on in the process and the language learning of the learner. When we think about errors, it's always important to think about the linguistic and cultural background of the learner, the prior knowledge they're bringing to the classroom, and the home language present in the classroom. These all have an impact on how learners grapple with and access language.
Which models are applicable for focusing on language learning for all in the classroom?
There are a lot of models to promote the language capacity in the classroom, and I'll describe in depth one model we have developed in Finland together with teachers. The aim of this ASM model is to facilitate the competencies of reading and writing literacy in multilingual classroom when the students' literacy skills are various. Well, there are three cornerstones to follow in this model. A means amount of reading, namely any kind of text material and also enough time for reading. S means suitability of text material, and that's interesting to topics, famous genres, etc., as well as suitability to the level of reading skills. M means meaningfulness to students, so that the action around the text makes sense to them. Reading environments and activities are somehow meaningful to students, and there isn't reading acting as such. I give an example how the Finnish teachers used this ASM model in transversal learning, combining biology and domestic science in language learning settings. There was a greenhouse in the schoolyard where students used to grow plants, also different herbs. At the same time, they learned what various herbs need in order to grow properly, and namely oregano needs different soil than basil. When the herbs grow, the students made notes about their properties and collected them to the table. The notes consisted of the observations via senses: how does the herb smell, what does it look like, etc. Wording of observations and phenomena concerning plants growing as biological content was learned at the same time. Further, the student searched information about the herbs in medical purposes, plus their history and prevalence globally, and composed posters under that. At the end, the students made the whole menu in which the dishes were spiced with herbs. In this task, the linguistical resources were diversely used in the classroom, while information of contents was collected by various routes and named. In addition, Latin came more familiar in the text of herbs as medicine. Also, meaning making in posters via visual modes was get to know. According to the students, the learning task was meaningful and also useful to them. As teachers, we noticed how important it was to give multimodal meaning-making tools for learning in the multilingual classrooms. In that way, each student could choose those tools which were suitable in that situation to their purposes. What are some specific methods that can be used in the classroom to ensure language learning for all?
Well, we have a lot of teaching methods we can use in our classroom for ensuring language learning for all. For example, cooperative learning, peer tutoring, laboratories, and so on. But it is important to keep a fundamental aspect in mind. The main thing is not to focus on one specific method that best meets the needs of the class, but to implement and alternate the different teaching strategies, increasing the possibility that all students are involved in the learning process with their own personality, characteristics, and specificities. Concentrating the teaching learning process on a single teaching method is always a source of error, even if it represents the most recommended of that period or if it was based on traditional teaching methods. Instead, what is important to consider is the difference between teacher-centered methods and pupil-centered methods. In the first case, the focus is on the teacher, who can implement a range of teaching methods in which students mainly play a passive role. One example could be the frontal lesson, only when it is the main method used and it poorly assumes the structure of a transmissive lecture where teacher explains and students listen and take notes. In the second case, students are the protagonists of the learning process who actively experiment and act, constructing their own learning under the guidance and the supervision of the teacher. This approach includes, for example, active workshops, cooperative or group learning, learning technologies, and so on. The latter helps learners to use language to access content, using different modes for scaffolding the language learning, so technologies can support students for learning in different ways, respecting their learning styles and reinforcing their motivation. One particular method for ensuring language learning for all could be content-based instruction or content and language integrated learning, namely CLIL, which involves the teaching of certain school subjects in a language other than the learner's school language. The focus in these types of lesson is on the topic or school subject, and the students learn the subject using the language they are trying to learn. In content-based instruction, it is important to define both content learning objectives and language learning objectives so that all learners can access the language being used. CLIL is a helpful method, but it's necessary to consider the relationship between learners and school subjects, because if students like a particular school subject but they don't like the language, they might end up not liking the school subject itself. What does it mean to scaffold language?
Scaffolding is a term used in language education in particular, and it basically refers to breaking up language learning into meaningful chunks. An important aspect of scaffolding is that it relates not only to vocabulary and syntax and grammar, but also to the ideas and prerequisite knowledge needed to access particular content. So we want to also scaffold the ideas being addressed or the content being addressed. This is really important not only for language teachers, but for all teachers who are guiding learners who are using language to access subject areas.
Why is it important to define both content learning objectives and language learning objectives in multilingual classroom? How can you define them?
In order to ensure that all learners have access to the language of instruction, it is important to define both content learning and language learning objectives. We can encourage teachers to explicitly reflect on the prior knowledge needed within the language issues and the content issues, and after that to define the learning outcomes. In the reflection process, teachers can use the PID model, which comes from the words perception, interpretation, and decision making. PID offers the model for teachers noticing both language and content issues of students in classroom. In perception phase, teachers' attention focuses on some specific component of language and interaction or other content at a time. Then they interpret the findings under the experience, knowledge, and familiarity of the group. In the last decision-making phase, the teacher comes to a conclusion about activities in the classroom. Classroom observing in language settings belongs to teachers' competencies, which form a part of teachers' professionalism. Anyway, it can be challenging to get on the prior knowledge by PID method, even by the advanced teacher. For example, the student may appear not to be involved in the lesson, although they are actually doing intensive thinking work. so practicing observation is needed, and co-teaching is a great opportunity to maintain and develop that skill at school. The result of both teachers' observations when co-teaching can be compared.
Can you describe the Universal Design for Learning UDL framework and how it can support teachers engaging with language accessibility for all?
Okay, so Universal Design for Learning is about variability, and it's about the different ways that our brain learns. And what UDL does is break how our brain learns up into 3 principles that we can use to engage students in their learning. These principles are engagement, representation, and action and expression. Now, if you think about these principles in terms of your learning in the classroom, I can give you some really nice examples. So in terms of engagement, and you've already spoken about it, when you think about bringing the students' first language into the classroom, where they can see themselves in the classroom, if you ask them what their primary word for a word you're teaching, or for the word you taught yesterday, that is engaging them in the lesson, and that is bringing that contextual aspect to the learning as well. If you think about representation, this is about the content you are delivering to the student and how they are able to access that content. So if you are teaching a new word and you just give the word on a worksheet with some sentences for them to fill in, they're not going to be able to do that if they aren't able to access the new word in different ways. So that could be through audio, where it's phonetically spelt out for them. That could be through a visual sign. So I was walking through the corridor today, and the classrooms here have subjects written in Italian and German. I don't speak Italian or German, so in most rooms, I don't know what subjects are being taught. But in one door, they had Italian, they had German, and then they had a music note. I know music is happening in that classroom. So that is an example of representation. In terms of action and expression, it is about understanding the goal, and you talked about the goal-orientated aspect of accessible language earlier. So it is focusing on that accessibility, knowing your goal, and making sure there are no barriers to the students demonstrating they achieved the goal. So again, for example, you could be doing a grammar lesson. If you just give the students a written test to see do they know that grammar, if a student has dyslexia or if a student is slow at writing, then they're not going to be able to process as well. If you give them the opportunity to speak to you and orally demonstrate their knowledge of the grammar, you can get a much better understanding of where the student is at, also building their confidence because now they know you know where they are at, and then you begin to challenge them rather than supporting them based on a written test that wasn't designed to help them show them best selves. So that's UDL in a very short nutshell, and I hope some good examples of how it can be used to language accessibility.
How can we promote and support the language identities of all our students in multilingual or classrooms?
Okay, so this question really relates to the intersection between language and identity construction. The languages we speak, our accent, our grammar, our syntax, and our usage, these all impact the way others perceive us, and also how we construct our identity. So it's constantly being negotiated and co-constructed with others through a combination of how we perceive of ourselves and also how others perceive of us. So in language learning classrooms, it's important to create spaces where learners feel they can express all of their identities and define for themselves who they are and which identities they feel are strongest for them. An important piece of that is developing and making use of curricular materials that represent a range of backgrounds, traditions, cultures, so that learners feel seen and represented in the materials being used in the classroom. Learners who feel represented and present and feel their identities are validated are ultimately more successful language learners. So in multilingual classrooms, teachers can support this identity construction process and fostering a multiplicity of identities.
Can you describe your experiences teaching and working in a multilingual and multicultural classroom?
So I've been teaching in Sweden for 12 years, and I work with supporting newly arrived immigrant students that come to Sweden from a variety of backgrounds. And firstly, they come and are put together in a preparation class for a maximum of 2 years. And so we have a group of different ages, abilities, ethnicities, backgrounds, all together in one class. And it's quite a challenge. And we're seeing a rise in multi-language classrooms all over the world. So it's something that teachers everywhere really need to be aware of. How we recognise the diversity of our students, what they're bringing to the table in terms of background and cultural experience, and how this experience of being together with many different people is enriching, and we should celebrate it. It's also important to think about how this experience might affect their learning identity and mark them for the rest of their school career. Therefore, we have to be really positive and encouraging about their own home languages. So in Sweden, we support them by using translanguaging, and we use that as a method of recognizing where they're from, but also integrating them into a new system.